At 2:17, a Russian fuel train rolled through occupied Luhansk under blackout conditions, still short of its offload point, when a Ukrainian screen marked it green. Not for safe passage. For impact. The locomotive was moving like a rear area routine. Tank cars behind it. Lubricants, fuel, support cargo, the kind of load that does not trend on maps but decides whether armored vehicles move at dawn or sit dead along a tree line waiting for delivery that never comes. Russian planners treated the route as secure enough to run at night, under discipline, away from the immediate violence of the front. But the front had already expanded. And that is the first thing to understand about this strike. The train was not crossing a rear area. It was moving inside a battlefield that had widened without Moscow fully admitting it. By the time those wheels were turning through the dark, the train had likely stopped being just a train days earlier. It had become a trackable event. A schedule. A pattern. A future target with a fixed geometry. That is what modern war does to logistics. It turns movement into signature. A rail convoy is efficient. It can move fuel, ammunition, spare parts, generators, heavy equipment, and replacement systems in quantities trucks cannot match over long distance. For Russia, that matters enormously. Large-scale operations have always leaned hard on rail. Troops move by rail. Armor moves by rail. Fuel moves by rail. Even when the last stretch has to go by truck, the rail network is what gets mass close enough to matter. But rails create a different kind of vulnerability. A truck can reroute. A train cannot improvise. A locomotive does not hide in a hedgerow. It follows steel that was laid long before the war. Once the route is known, once the loading pattern is known, once the likely unloading node is known, the problem stops being, where is it, and becomes, when do we close the window? And somewhere on the Ukrainian side of this war, that countdown had already begun. The likely chain starts well before the strike itself. Satellite passes. Drone reconnaissance. Partisan observation. Signals collection. Dispatch habits. Fuel demand reports from forward units. Repair requests from Russian drone detachments. Communications bursts around loading points. None of these pieces alone are enough. Together, they build a picture. Not a cinematic miracle. Not one secret superweapon. Just disciplined accumulation. A rail line. A scheduled drift. A convoy that should have moved yesterday but moved tonight instead. That matters because time is everything in a fuel strike. Hit too early and the cargo gets redistributed. Hit too late and the fuel is already inside trucks, already dispersed, already on its way to battalion depots and launch positions. So the target is not merely the train. It is the transfer point. The timing. The next 24 to 48 hours of Russian operations that depend on that cargo arriving intact. That is where this stops being a simple interdiction story and becomes something much more dangerous. Because this was not happening in isolation. Around the same phase of the war, Ukrainian reporting and open-source analysis pointed to a broader pattern. Fuel trains in occupied Luhansk struck near places like Shkodov and Stanitsia Luhanska, logistics facilities in occupied territories mapped and hit, drone-related infrastructure attacked, communications sites disrupted, and Russian rail movements increasingly treated as operational targets rather than background activity. The point was not only to destroy hardware. It was to widen the cost of every Russian movement behind the line. That is war spiraling outward from the obvious point of contact. The locomotive crew would not have seen that wider picture. They would have seen signals, track, darkness, routine. Maybe a dispatcher's clipped voice. Maybe a revised transit order. Maybe a little extra pressure because night movement always feels different. When you know someone, somewhere, is hunting infrastructure. But the Russian vulnerability was bigger than one crew. By 2025, even Russian railways was showing strain, cargo volumes under pressure, labor shortages, locomotive shortages, network friction, military cargo prioritization. That matters because a healthy system absorbs disruption. A stressed system amplifies it. One damaged train in a resilient network is a problem. One damaged train in a strained wartime network can become a chain of missed unloads, blocked tracks, delayed follow-on cargo, and frontline shortages that spread faster than the initial fireball. That is the hidden danger in attacking logistics. The flames are only the visible part. The real damage happens on the map afterward. And that map, on this night, was about to change. Picture the timing. A moving rail target at night. A route that appears safer than roads because it avoids scattered ambushes and drone-swept truck convoys. A support package behind it somewhere farther east or south. Units expecting resupply. Maintenance crews waiting on lubricants. Generators waiting on fuel. Possibly drone elements waiting on replacement material. The train is not glamorous, but it is connected to everything. Now add the other side. A Ukrainian cell has to decide whether this is worth the expenditure. Strike assets are finite. Deep attacks are never just about accuracy. They are about trade-offs. If you spend drones or missiles here, you are not spending them on a command node, an ammo site, an air defense battery, or a bridge. So the strike only makes sense if the train is more than a train. It has to be part of a larger operational hinge. Near the middle of this story, that realization becomes the whole script. The train is not the payload. The train is the fuse. Once that becomes clear, the rest of the campaign makes sense. You do not just hit the moving fuel. You line up everything around it. The offload area. The repair point. The telecom node that coordinates local response. The depot that would cushion the shock. The drone site that helps Russia see the recovery effort and protect the route tomorrow. In a multi-domain campaign, the purpose is not to create one explosion. It is to create a systems failure. That is how local strikes become theater pressure. And that is exactly what makes this title more serious than it first sounds. Russia thought its supply train was secure is not just about arrogance. It is about an outdated definition of secure. Secure used to mean distance from artillery, some camouflage, some air defense, movement at night, and a route behind the immediate front. But drones changed the depth of the battlefield. ISR changed the meaning of concealment. Signals discipline failures changed routine into exposure. In modern war, a secure rail route is secure only until somebody has your pattern. After that, you are just moving on borrowed time. So when the strike comes, it should not be imagined as a random hit in the dark. It is better understood as the closing act of a longer process. The first blast is not merely destructive. It is declarative. It says, we knew where this would be. If the target is a fuel train, the physical effects can be savage. Secondary fires. Burning tank cars. Heat forcing rail crews and security detachments away from the line. Damage that complicates firefighting and salvage. A rail corridor blocked not just by wreckage, but by risk. You cannot rush crews into a line of burning fuel cars and pretend the network is functioning. Every minute of fire becomes an hour of delay somewhere else. And delay, in war, is a weapon. Now the spiral widens. Russian commanders have choices, but they are all bad. Shift more cargo to trucks and become even more exposed to drone interdiction on roads. Pause movement and starve tempo at the front. Reassign air defense to logistics hubs and leave other assets thinner. Push engineering and rail repair crews forward. And expose them to follow-on strikes. Increase electronic warfare emissions and reveal where the protective architecture actually is. Every response creates another signature. This is where the human pressure changes level. Somewhere behind the sector, a Russian logistics officer is no longer looking at a train incident. He is looking at a clock. Which battalions run short first? Which artillery group loses fuel margin? Which drone units get rationed? Which trucks can cover the gap? What road capacity is still available? How much of the train can be salvaged? Can the unloading point receive a substitute convoy before daylight? Can the route even reopen before the next attack cycle? And the most dangerous question of all. Was this the main strike, or was this just the first visible one? Because if Ukraine has been tracking the train for days, then the train is probably part of a broader map. The analysts who found it probably found other things too. That is what turns a logistics attack into escalation. Not political escalation. Operational escalation. The battle expands from trenches and tree lines to switching stations, fuel storage, drone maintenance, rail dispatch, and command confidence. A commander who thought he was managing one sector is suddenly managing a wounded network. A battlefield that looked local becomes systemic. Reported Ukrainian strikes in this period reinforce that broader picture. Fuel trains in occupied Luhansk were not the only targets being discussed. There were also claims and reports of strikes on repair bases, fuel storage, communications nodes, and even drone infrastructure in occupied Crimea, including damage to Orion systems at Kirovsky airfield. That matters because it shows the logic of a campaign: blind the route, burn the fuel, pressure the repair chain, and degrade the aerial layer that helps the enemy watch, escort, or recover. Air, ground, logistics, command. Not four separate fights. One widening one. And that is the midpoint revelation Moscow keeps running into in this war. The Russian system often sees discrete incidents. A train hit here. A depot hit there. A UAV site damaged somewhere else. But the operational picture is harsher. The enemy is not attacking random objects. It is attacking the connections between them. Once those connections start failing, everything slows. A train delay becomes a fuel shortage. A fuel shortage becomes fewer vehicle movements. Fewer movements change assault timing. Changed timing exposes units waiting in place. Units waiting in place burn more fuel on generators, concealment, and repositioning. Then they ask for more supply from a network that is already on fire. That is how a strike on steel tracks reaches the front line without ever appearing there. There is also a psychological layer, and it should not be underestimated. Logistics personnel are not supposed to feel like frontline prey. Dispatchers, locomotive crews, unload teams, rail engineers, depot managers, maintenance staffs, these are the people who keep an army alive by assuming the rear is difficult, not suicidal. Once that assumption breaks, throughput breaks with it. Drivers hesitate. Movements get delayed for escorts. Commanders hoard stock instead of distributing it. Everyone begins protecting inventory instead of spending it. The army gets heavier, slower, more suspicious, and less flexible. That is victory without a breakthrough. At some point in the night, the Ukrainian side also has its decisive choice. Not whether to attack. When to stop. Because a disciplined strike campaign does not spend itself in celebration. It preserves pressure. If the train is burning, the temptation is to keep pouring assets into the same spectacle. But the smarter move is often colder: let the wreck block the line, let the panic force reallocations, and hit the next node the enemy has no choice but to reveal. The recovery route. The replacement depot. The command post that lights up its communications because now it has to. That kind of restraint is what separates destruction from operational design. And that is why the train matters beyond the blast footage. The fire is the easy part to understand. The harder part, and the more consequential part, is how the strike alters Russian behavior the next morning. More escorts. More dispersal. More rerouting. More defensive emissions. More precious air defense coverage spent on the logistics spine. More friction in a system already under strain. Ukraine does not need every train to die. It needs Russian planners to believe that every train can. That changes how an army moves. By dawn, the train is no longer the story. The story is the widening radius of response around it. Dispatch screens rewritten. Fuel estimates revised. Road convoys improvised. Drone support retasked. Repair teams rushed. Security expanded. Frontline expectations lowered. The battlefield has stretched backward, and everyone inside the Russian supply chain now knows it. That is the real humiliation here. Not that one convoy was found. That the line between front and rear was found to be false. And if this feels like a narrow logistics episode, it should not. Modern war is full of moments that look small until you measure what depended on them. A tank battalion without fuel is not a combat arm. A drone unit without lubricants and generators is not a surveillance network. A command that cannot trust its rail timing cannot plan offensives with confidence. A military that moves by fixed infrastructure but can no longer hide the rhythm of that movement becomes predictable in the one place predictability is fatal: sustainment. Russia thought the supply train was secure because it still believed security was about guarding the cargo. Ukraine treated security as a question of pattern. And once the pattern was exposed, the strike was only the visible part of a much larger defeat. That is the cold lesson. Wars do no. Spiral only when capitals issue threats or fleets exchange fire. They spiral when one side realizes its support architecture is now a target set, and every attempt to protect it reveals more of the system underneath. In that kind of war, the train is never just a train. It is a moving piece of an entire command structure, an industrial chain, a timetable, and a belief about where danger ends. On this battlefield, danger did not end at the trenches. It was waiting on the tracks.